It's pretty unprecedented time right now in terms of in a lot of areas of our society, obviously, but particularly in campaigns. I would just add a couple things to what Betsy said. I think in terms of what Idaho just did, I think it was pretty extraordinary, very extraordinary work by the Secretary of State's office because, again, one big differentiation, for example, between what Idaho did and what Oregon and Washington does is that in Oregon and Washington, they mail everyone a ballot. In Idaho, you had to request one. And so it was always kind of a question of what was going to really happen in terms of turnout. And having done a lot of work in 50 states and seen a lot of mail-in ballots in varying degrees of how they do it in different states and how they do it, for example, in California versus Oregon and Washington, it was always kind of a question of what would voter behavior really look like, because generally it takes some time over a few cycles for voters to get used to the ability to be able to vote by mail. And here it was pretty extraordinary. I mean, it really did work really, really well. Turnout was very, very high. And the other thing that was crazy was that Election Day was 2 weeks after, they extended it 2 weeks. And so it was pretty unprecedented. It makes it difficult from the campaign side because it takes away it makes it much more difficult in your planning processes because you're used to having a finite date when it's over, and you can work backwards from Election Day for everything you're trying to do, from budgeting to planning to et cetera. Well, here in Idaho, it was literally, you had 2 weeks plus, and you didn't have any real historical data to give you a guidance of what voter turnout was going to really look like. All you had was a bunch of people kind of giving their ideas and their guesses. And at the end of the day, it did work really, really well. And I do think that Chad and the Secretary of State and their team deserve a lot of credit, and the governor as well, for sticking by his guns and kind of pushing the election through when a lot of people kind of thought maybe it'd be better to delay it till the end of the summer. In terms of campaigns, it's the Wild West a little bit right now in terms of what you can and can't do. I just did a big campaign in Oregon, and it really changed the dynamic of your ability to campaign. And so obviously everything's going virtual, which is much, much different than what you're used to when you see campaigns where you can go retail. Doing a lot of virtual town halls, obviously, either through Zoom or through Google or Facebook Live. You're doing fundraising basically through there. In some ways, it has helped a little bit of the fundraising, because fundraising events are very helpful to raise money. But at the end of the day, the candidate picking up the phone and calling their friends and family and everyone actually makes a difference. So in some ways, that has increased the ability of candidates to have more time and force them to actually have to get on the phone and do what they're supposed to do to raise money. But it has hindered in the ability to do in-person events, which do create excitement and do allow you to increase on the fundraising front. Plus the whole Corona pandemic, in terms of how it's affected the economy and ability of people to donate, has definitely made it challenging in that regard. In terms of communicating to voters, it's so much harder. It actually has increased the potency in very competitive races of your direct mail vote, your direct voter contact. So if you have the budget to run television, if you have the budget to do digital advertising, to do direct mail, it really can give a candidate a significant advantage, because they don't have to retail politic anymore, and they can't really. So those candidates with more resources to communicate their message to voters through those means, can give them a huge advantage. And the other thing is, what we've seen is obviously an uptick in people on digital through the Corona pandemic. People are much more obviously on their phones, but there also, we've seen, is an increase in people watching their local news. And so we've seen some real increase in efficiencies in being able to buy broadcast adjacencies in terms of when we're targeting our television advertising. Depending on whether you're, in a Republican or a Democratic primary, obviously Fox News was through the roof, but MSNBC was through the roof in terms of their ratings. So your targeting and your efficiencies on television actually went up, as well as your digital advertising. But your direct mail also is very important as in this environment. And we saw it in Oregon, we saw it in Idaho, where again, now voters are having to vote by mail. So they're looking at their mail more, particularly older voters. And so it's ramped up the importance of being able to communicate to voters in all areas, but also reduce the ability of that direct contact between a candidate and a voter, which I think is a sad thing and not good for our democracy. But it's kind of been what's been happening in the short run right now, until we obviously hopefully get in a better spot with the overall pandemic. Cash is king if you use it right. I do think it's changed. It has changed for now. Whether it will be the long term, I think you got to be careful. I don't think it will be. But in terms of consumers' habits and viewing, et cetera, we had to learn very quickly how to adjust and adapt to what was happening during the pandemic, which was very unique. And I don't think will continue. But there were some things we learned from them that I think will continue to the future. So cash is king, but I do think I would just say that again, we got outspent dramatically in one race and won. You know, it's being able to efficiently, just like in any campaign, use it effectively and have the right message and the right messenger. I think message, I guess, is still king in my view of any campaign, and then cash is nice to have to get your message out for sure.